The old medical building felt cold and empty. General Vexthul sat in his wheelchair, his once powerful reptilian body now frail and shaking. His green scales, which used to shine with pride, now looked dull and grey. Deep scars ran across his face, reminders of battles fought long ago. Across from him sat journalist Nira Kaldos, a young woman with kind eyes but a serious expression. She had been trying to get this interview for 3 years. Every other war general had spoken publicly about the human coalition war, but not Vexthul. He had disappeared after the war ended, hiding away in medical facilities and refusing to talk to anyone. The room was completely silent, except for the soft hum of Nira's recording device. She placed it carefully on the metal table between them, her hands trembling slightly. This was the biggest story of her career. "General," she said softly, "you've been silent about the war for 3 years now. Every other military leader has given interviews, written books, appeared on news shows, but not you. What finally made you decide to speak?" Vexthul stared at the recording device for a long moment. His claws, once sharp weapons of war, now scratched nervously against the table's surface, leaving thin marks in the metal. When he finally looked up, his yellow eyes seemed haunted, like someone who had seen things that shouldn't exist. "The nightmares," he whispered, his voice rough and broken. "Every single night for 3 years, I see their faces. I hear their voices, the humans. They never leave me alone, even in sleep." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "My doctors say talking might help. They say if I share what happened, maybe the memories will stop burning inside my mind. But I think there's another reason I need to speak." Nira leaned forward, not wanting to miss a single word. "The galaxy needs to understand what we really fought against," Vexthul continued. "Everyone thinks they know the story of the human coalition war. They think it was just another conquest, another weak species that got in our way. But they're wrong. So terribly, completely wrong." His scales rippled with what looked like fear, an emotion no one had ever seen from the legendary general before. "I need to tell the truth about humanity before someone else makes the same mistake we did. Before another species looks at those small pink creatures and thinks they're harmless. Because if that happens—" He trailed off, his whole body shuddering. What we faced out there wasn't an army or even a civilization. It was something much worse. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about war, about survival, about what intelligent beings are capable of when you push them too far. The general's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They made us understand that some enemies are more dangerous when they're losing than when they're winning." Vexthul's eyes stared past Nira, looking at something only he could see. His breathing slowed as he traveled back in memory to that fateful day when everything began. "It was supposed to be routine," he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone telling a ghost story. "We had done it 1,000 times before with 1,000 different species. The Kepler sector showed all the signs of a young civilization, radio signals bouncing around their star system, small metal ships barely capable of reaching their own moon." He shifted in his wheelchair, wincing as old wounds protested. "Our science team spent weeks studying them from a distance. They catalogued everything, their technology level, their population size, their military capabilities. The report was only 3 pages long, 3 pages for an entire species." The general's mandibles clicked together, a nervous habit that had gotten worse since the war. "Category 3 civilization," the report said. That meant they were just barely capable of space travel. No energy weapons, no force fields, no faster-than-light communication. Their biggest ships carried maybe 100 crew members. We had single fighters that could destroy their entire fleet. Nira noticed how his claws gripped the armrests of his wheelchair as he continued. "So we sent the diplomatic fleet. 5 massive ships, each one the size of a small city. We approached their home system slowly, broadcasting the standard message in their primitive languages. Most species at their level would see our ships and immediately surrender. Some would try to negotiate, a few would panic and scatter." Vexthul's voice grew quieter. "But these humans, they did something different. Instead of fear or confusion, we received a clear transmission from their military commander. He called himself Admiral Park, and his voice was completely calm. Too calm." The general paused, his yellow eyes focusing on Nira again. Park's message was unlike anything we had heard before. He said, "We know why you're here. We're not interested in joining your coalition. Please leave our space." Just like that. No begging, no threats, no questions about our technology or our numbers. Just a simple request for us to leave. A bitter sound escaped from Vexthul's throat, something that might have been laughter once. We found it amusing. Here was this tiny species, barely capable of reaching their own planet's moon, politely asking the most powerful military force in the galaxy to go away. Our fleet commander decided to follow standard protocol. He sent back the usual response: submit to coalition rule or face the consequences of resistance. The general's scales darkened as he remembered what came next. Admiral Park's reply came back within minutes. No pleading, no negotiations, no attempts to buy time. Just 4 words that should have warned us about what we were really dealing with. Vexthul's voice dropped to a whisper. "Very well, we choose consequences." That's when we realized we might have misjudged them. Vexthul's claws began scratching deeper grooves into the metal table as he continued his story. The sound made Nira wince, but she didn't dare interrupt. After Admiral Park chose consequences, we followed our standard playbook, the general said, his voice becoming more strained with each word. For 300 years, the coalition had perfected this process. Show overwhelming force, destroy one military target, then wait for the inevitable surrender. It worked on every species we had ever encountered. He paused, staring at his scarred hands. We selected their moon base, a small research station with maybe 50 personnel. Nothing too dramatic, just enough to show them what our weapons could do. The fleet commander ordered a single missile strike. Clean, precise, minimal loss of life. Nira leaned forward as Vexthul's breathing became heavier. The missile hit perfectly. Their lunar facility disappeared in a flash of light visible from their home planet. We expected panic broadcasts within minutes. Government officials begging for mercy, military leaders offering surrender, civilians demanding their leaders give up the fight. The general's scales rippled with what looked like confusion, even years later. Instead, we intercepted something completely different: personal communications between families. A mother named Kim recording a message for her children, telling them she loved them and to be brave. A father explaining to his son how to take care of the family farm. An elderly man teaching his grandson a traditional song over the radio. Vexthul's voice cracked slightly. But they weren't crying or screaming. They were calm, almost prepared, like they had practiced for this moment their entire lives. We realized they weren't saying goodbye because they were afraid. They were saying goodbye because they had work to do. He shifted uncomfortably in his wheelchair, old wounds clearly still causing him pain. Within 6 hours of our demonstration attack, something impossible happened. Every human settlement across dozens of worlds began moving simultaneously, not running away in panic, but executing what could only be described as a perfectly coordinated evacuation plan. The general's yellow eyes grew wide with remembered shock. Civilian transports lifted off from every major city, carrying women, children, and elderly to hidden locations we couldn't track. But the military personnel didn't retreat. Instead, they moved into positions we hadn't even detected during our months of surveillance. Defensive bunkers, weapon platforms, communication arrays, all hidden so well our best sensors had missed them completely. Vexthul's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That's when our intelligence officers made a terrifying discovery. These fortifications weren't hastily built after our arrival. They were decades old. Some showed signs of construction spanning generations. The humans had been preparing for this war since before we even knew they existed. His scales turned, almost black with fear. We hadn't discovered a primitive civilization. We had walked into a trap that had been waiting for us for over 50 years. The scratching sound of Vexthul's claws against the metal table grew louder as his agitation increased. Nira could see deep gouges forming in the surface, evidence of the general's inner turmoil as he relived these memories. Everything we knew about warfare became useless the moment we engaged the humans, Vexthul said, his voice shaking. For centuries, the coalition had fought civilized wars. Armies met armies, fleets battled fleets. There were rules, traditions, ways that intelligent species conducted conflict. The humans threw all of that away on the first day. He paused, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Our first real battle was supposed to be easy. We cornered a small human cargo ship near their asteroid belt. Just a simple freighter carrying mining equipment, or so we thought. The pilot identified himself as Lee, and we ordered him to surrender for questioning. The general's scales began changing color, shifting from their normal green to a sickly yellow. Lee responded by turning his ship directly toward our flagship. Our sensors detected massive antimatter storage in his cargo hold, enough to power a small city. We realized too late that it wasn't mining equipment, it was a bomb. Vexthul's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but Nira could hear every word in the silent room. Before impact, Lee opened communications on every frequency. His voice was completely calm as he said, "Tell your families you died because someone decided our children didn't deserve to live." Then he smiled at the camera and added, "This is what happens when you threaten our kids." The general's whole body began trembling as he continued. The explosion tore through our flagship like it was made of paper. 8,000 coalition soldiers died instantly. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing that every human cargo ship, every transport, every civilian vessel was carrying the same antimatter payloads. Nira felt her blood run cold as the implications sank in. Within days, we discovered that the humans had turned everything into weapons. Their orbital research stations weren't studying space. They were massive kinetic bombardment platforms, ready to drop rocks on our landing forces. Their mining colonies on distant asteroids weren't extracting resources. They were nuclear bomb factories, with fusion reactors rigged to explode if we got too close. Vexthul's claws scraped against the table more frantically. Every human settlement, every space station, every ship was a potential weapon. They had spent decades preparing not just to fight us, but to make sure that defeating them would cost us everything. A mother would hug her children goodbye, then walk into a reactor room and trigger an explosion that would take out an entire coalition battalion. His voice cracked completely as he spoke his next words. We weren't fighting soldiers anymore. We were fighting an entire species that had decided death was preferable to surrender, and they were determined to take as many of us with them as possible. Vexthul's voice became so quiet that Nira had to lean across the table to hear him. The general's eyes were fixed on a spot somewhere beyond the room's walls, as if he was seeing ghosts that only he could perceive. There was a battle near the Proxima system, he began, his words coming slowly and carefully. One of our heavy cruisers took damage and was drifting in space. The crew sent out distress signals, but we couldn't reach them in time. They were going to die out there alone in the cold vacuum. The general's breathing became uneven as he continued. Then something unexpected happened. A human medical ship approached the wreckage. We watched through long-range scanners as they cut through the hull and began pulling out survivors. Coalition soldiers, badly injured, some barely alive. Vexthul's scales began to ripple, a sign of deep emotional distress among his species. The human leading the rescue was a doctor named Han. Our surviving soldiers later told us how gentle he was, how carefully he treated their wounds. He had steady hands and kind eyes. He worked for hours, saving life after life, using his own medical supplies to help enemy soldiers. Nira noticed that the general's claws had stopped scratching the table. Instead, his hands were perfectly still, frozen in memory. For the first time since the war began, we thought maybe we had been wrong about humans. Maybe they had some decency, some compassion. Our rescued soldiers spoke about Han with genuine gratitude. They said he was a true healer, someone who valued life above politics or war. The general's voice began to crack. Then, 3 days later, every coalition communication channel received the same broadcast. Han appeared on screen, standing in what looked like a medical facility. Behind him were all the soldiers he had rescued, now strapped to medical tables. Vexthul's whole body began shaking. Han looked directly into the camera and began speaking about medical ethics. He talked about the oath doctors take to preserve life, about how healing was sacred, about how every sentient being deserved compassion. His voice was calm, educational, like a professor giving a lecture. The general had to pause, struggling to continue. Then he picked up a medical instrument and began killing each patient, one by one. Not quickly, not mercifully. Slowly, methodically, while explaining that mercy was a choice humans could make or take away whenever they wanted. Nira felt sick as she listened, but forced herself to keep recording. "The worst part wasn't the deaths," Vexthul whispered. "The worst part was Han's expression. He looked genuinely sad as he did it, like he was disappointed that it had to happen. He ended the broadcast by saying, 'We saved your people because we choose to be merciful. Remember that the next time you threaten our families.'" The general's voice broke completely. "After that, our soldiers began surrendering rather than accepting human medical aid. They were more afraid of human kindness than human weapons." Vexthul's mandibles began clicking together rapidly, a sound like chattering teeth that filled the quiet room. His yellow eyes had taken on a wild, almost manic quality as he delved deeper into his memories. "The humans learned faster than any species we had ever encountered," he said, his voice rising and falling unpredictably. "It wasn't just their weapons or their tactics. They could look at our technology and understand it in ways that shouldn't have been possible." He leaned forward in his wheelchair, his claws gripping the armrest so tightly that the metal began to bend. "We lost a medical transport early in the war. Standard coalition vessel, nothing special about it. The humans salvaged the wreckage, and within weeks they had figured out how our medical scanners worked. But they didn't just copy the technology. They improved it." The general's scales shifted color again, this time to a deep, troubled purple. "An engineer named Choi took those medical scanners and turned them into something terrifying. She modified them to track the unique energy signatures of our ship engines. Suddenly humans could find our vessels anywhere in space, even when we were hiding behind planets or in asteroid fields." Nira watched as Vexthul's breathing became more erratic. But Choi's work was nothing compared to what a scientist called Yang accomplished. Yang specialized in terraforming technology, equipment designed to make dead planets suitable for life, peaceful technology, meant to create gardens in space. The general's voice dropped to a horrified whisper. Yang took that terraforming equipment and turned it into biological warfare. She created diseases that were completely harmless to humans, but deadly to every coalition species. Our soldiers would land on planets that seemed perfectly safe, breathe the air, drink the water, and within days they would start dying from illnesses that didn't even exist before the war. Vexthul's mandibles clicked so rapidly they sounded like a machine gun. The worst part wasn't the weapons or the diseases. The worst part was what they did to our minds. Humans had something they called entertainment, music, stories, visual, art. We thought it was harmless, maybe even useful for understanding their culture. His eyes went completely unfocused, staring at something beyond the room. But they had weaponized even that. Coalition soldiers who listened to human music or watched their movies began experiencing what our military psychologists called existential breakdown. They would sit in their bunkers, staring at nothing, questioning everything they had ever believed about life, death, purpose, meaning. The general's voice became almost sing-song, as if he was reciting something he had memorized. The humans weren't just attacking our bodies or our technology. They were attacking our souls, our understanding of reality itself. They made our soldiers question why they were fighting, whether their own species deserved to survive, whether the universe had any meaning at all. Vexthul suddenly focused on Nira again, his eyes blazing with remembered terror. They were rewriting the very foundations of who we were as thinking beings. And the most terrifying part? Some of our soldiers thanked them for it. The change in Vexthul was sudden and devastating. His reptilian features, which had maintained some composure throughout the interview, completely collapsed. His scales turned a sickly grey color, and his entire body began shaking uncontrollably. Nira watched in shock as tears, actual tears, began flowing from his yellow eyes. "Kepler 442b, he whispered, the name coming out like a curse. "Command told us it would be the battle that ended everything, one final demonstration of coalition power that would break human resistance forever." His voice cracked as he struggled to continue. "We brought everything we had, 50 warships, the largest orbital bombardment fleet ever assembled. The plan was simple: destroy every structure on the planet's surface, then land troops to secure whatever remained. Show the humans that resistance was completely pointless." Vexthul's claws scraped weakly against his wheelchair's armrests, leaving barely visible marks. The bombardment lasted for 6 hours straight. We turned the entire planet's surface into Molten glass. Nothing could have survived, not buildings, not vehicles, not even bacteria. Our sensors showed zero life signs when we finished. It was the most complete military victory in coalition history. The general paused, his breathing becoming labored and painful to watch. When our landing parties went down to secure the ruins, they found the tunnel networks. Miles and miles of underground passages, perfectly hidden from our sensors. The civilians had escaped. Every woman, every child, every young adult. They had vanished like ghosts. His scales rippled with remembered anguish, but thousands of elderly humans had stayed behind. Our troops found them in a massive underground facility that looked like some kind of community center. They were sitting in chairs holding hands, some of them singing quietly together. Vexthul's voice became barely audible. They were led by a woman named O. Our intelligence later learned she was dying from cancer, had maybe weeks to live. She had organized all the elderly volunteers into what they called the last gift. They had been waiting for our troops to find them. The general's whole body convulsed as he forced himself to continue. When our soldiers entered the facility, O stood up slowly. She was so frail she could barely walk, but her voice was clear and strong. She looked directly at our troops and said, "Welcome, soldiers. We have something for you." Nira felt her blood turn to ice as she watched Vexthul relive the moment. O pressed a button on a small device in her hand. Before our troops could react, she began broadcasting on all frequencies. "Our gift to you is understanding that some prices are too high to pay. Remember us when you think about conquering other worlds." The general's voice broke completely. The antimatter explosion lit up 3 star systems. 40,000 coalition troops died in an instant. We had achieved total military victory and learned that victory could be more terrifying than defeat. Vexthul's sobs echoed through the sterile medical room, each one seeming to tear something from deep inside his chest. Nira had never seen a coalition general cry before, and the sight was both heartbreaking and terrifying. His scales had turned completely grey, the color of ash after a fire. 3 days after Kepler 442b, I received a personal communication, he managed between broken breaths. It came directly to my private command channel, bypassed all our security systems, like they didn't even exist. When I opened it, Admiral Park's face appeared on my screen. The general wiped his eyes with the back of his clawed hand, leaving wet streaks across his reptilian features. I expected him to mock us, to threaten more attacks, to demand our surrender. Instead, Park looked tired, deeply, impossibly tired, like someone carrying a weight that was crushing his soul. His first words were, "I'm sorry you had to see that. General." Vexthul's voice became hollow, empty of everything except pain. Park continued speaking in that same exhausted tone. "General," he said, "we're not fighting to win your war. We never were. We're fighting to teach the galaxy a lesson that it will remember long after both of us are dead." Then his image disappeared, and my computer started receiving files. The general's claws trembled as he gestured weakly at the air. Thousands of files. Historical documents going back centuries. Battle plans that had been written before my grandfather was born. Psychological profiles of every coalition species, including detailed studies of our fears, our weaknesses, our breaking points. Nira felt the room growing colder as she listened. The humans had been preparing for this war for over 300 years. Every battle we had fought, every tactical decision we had made, every moment we thought we were winning, it had all been planned. They had studied us, predicted our moves, and engineered every single engagement to create maximum psychological impact. Vexthul's scales rippled with horrified understanding. The suicides, the martyrdom, the biological weapons, the psychological warfare, none of it was desperation. It was all carefully designed to send one message to every species in the galaxy. Attacking humanity will cost you more than any victory could ever be worth. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Within weeks of receiving those files, coalition member species began withdrawing their support. The Centaurians pulled their fleets first, then the Vegan Alliance, then the Outer Rim colonies. They all said the same thing. If we could drive humans to such extremes, what would we do to them if they ever disagreed with coalition policy? The General looked directly at Nera with eyes full of terrible knowledge. The humans had turned us into monsters, in the eyes of our own allies. They made the entire galaxy afraid of what the Coalition might become. And the worst part? They were right to be afraid. The silence that followed stretched between them like a living thing. Nera could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Could feel the weight of everything she had just learned pressing down on her chest. Vexthul sat motionless in his wheelchair, his grey scales barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. Minutes passed before the old general finally spoke again, his voice now completely drained of emotion. The war didn't end with a final battle or a peace treaty, he said, his claws moving absently across the deep scratches he had carved into the table's surface. It ended because the Coalition simply fell apart. One by one, our member species began leaving us. His yellow eyes grew distant again, seeing events that had happened years ago. First, the Centaurians announced they were withdrawing all military support. Their ambassador came to me personally and said, "If you can make humans do these things to themselves, what would you make us do?" Then the Vegan Alliance pulled out, followed by the Outer Rim territories, the mining guilds, everyone. Vexthul's voice cracked slightly as he continued. They weren't afraid of the humans anymore. They were afraid of us, afraid of what kind of empire could drive an entire species to weaponize their own deaths. They realized that if the Coalition could create enemies like humanity, then maybe the Coalition was the real monster in this story. The general paused, his breathing becoming more labored. But the humans, they had one final message for the galaxy. Admiral Park appeared on every communication channel, every broadcast frequency, every digital network across known space. The transmission still plays today, repeating endlessly. Nera leaned forward as Vexthul's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Park looked directly into the camera and said, "To any species considering humanity's conquest, we are still here. Earth's coordinates are attached to this message. You know where to find us if you want to finish what the Coalition started." Then he smiled, and it was the most terrifying smile I have ever seen. The general's scales rippled with remembered fear. That transmission has been broadcasting for 3 years now. Every species in the galaxy has received it. Every military leader, every government official, every citizen knows exactly where to find humanity if they want to try what we tried. Vexthul looked directly at Nera, his reptilian eyes reflecting something that went beyond fear into pure, existential terror. "Do you know how many species have accepted that invitation? How many have decided to attack Earth and finish the job?" "We started." He paused, letting the question hang in the air. "Zero. Not one. Not a single species in the entire galaxy has been willing to face what we faced." His voice became barely audible. "We finally understood that humanity's greatest weapon was never their technology or their tactics or their willingness to die. Their greatest weapon was making their enemies realize that some victories cost more than anyone should ever be willing to pay." The recording device clicked off with a soft beep, leaving only the sound of an old soldier's breathing and the terrible weight of understanding what humanity had really accomplished.